Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar, The Increasing Financial Vulnerability of Canadian Households, hosted by Prosper Canada. My name is Sasha McNicoll, and I am the Policy Manager at Prosper Canada. So just a few logistics before we begin. Please note that everyone in the audience has been put on mute. You can share any questions and respond to any questions asked using the question box function located in the GoToWebinar control. We'll be holding a dedicated Q&A period at the end of this webinar, but you're welcome to enter any questions into the question box at any time during the presentation. We will be sending the report discussed in today's presentation afterwards in an email to all registrants. The webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will also be shared on the Prosper Canada website and emailed to all registrants in the next few days. Please feel free to share this with any friends or colleagues who may benefit from the information that was shared in this presentation. In the spirit of truth and reconciliation, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the first people, the original people of this land who have been here since time immemorial. I'd like to express my deepest gratitude to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities and their ancestors who fulfilled their responsibilities to these lands, waters, plant life, and animal life so that we could all be here today. I'd also like to acknowledge that I am coming to you from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Iroquoian Confederacy, and the Wendat peoples, and that this territory is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I do not want to falsely suggest that I have profound knowledge of the dynamic migration and relationships among all Indigenous nations and communities of this territory, as well as the treaties, covenants, and wampum belts of this land, but I view continuing to learn about these living agreements as part of my responsibility towards advancing reconciliation. I'd like to acknowledge and thank everyone on the line joining us from traditional territories across Turtle Island. We're honored to be having this discussion with you today, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. This webinar is hosted by Prosper Canada. We were founded in 1986 and are a national charity dedicated to expanding economic opportunity for Canadians living in poverty through program and policy innovation. As Canada's leading champion of financial empowerment, we work with governments, businesses, and groups to develop and promote financial policies, programs, and resources that transform lives and foster the prosperity of all Canadians. So just a bit of an agenda for today. After this welcome and introduction, we will be hearing from Eloise Duncan from the Financial Resilience Institute to share with us an overview of the study Financial Vulnerability of Low-Income Canadians, a Rising Tide. We'd like to thank cooperators whose generous contribution made possible the research with the Financial Resilience Institute. Afterwards, we will have a panel discussion on how the increasing financial vulnerability of Canadians is playing out in community and how policymakers should respond. And then we'll have a Q&A from the questions that you all send in. So joining me today are Eloise Duncan. Eloise is the founder and CEO of the Financial Resilience Institute and is known as one of Canada's leading experts in financial health. She's a high-energy social entrepreneur and a certified management consultant with over 25 years of experience in financial services, strategic consulting, and financial health research, strategy, and impact measurement. Eloise was also the previous founder and CEO of Seymour Management Consulting, Inc., established in 2009, and the creator of the Seymour Financial Resilience Index. Also joining me is Louise Simbandumwe. She is co-director of SEED Winnipeg, a not-for-profit organization that works in partnership with over 100 organizations in Manitoba to deliver customized financial empowerment programs. Louise is a founding member and co-chair of the Manitoba Financial Empowerment Network and a founding member of the National Asset Building Learning Exchange, and currently serves on its steering committee. A former refugee, Louise is passionate about human rights and social justice. Louise has a Bachelor in Commerce from the University of Saskatchewan and a Master's in Comparative Social Research from Oxford University. So all that being said, Charmaine, if you could pass the presenter rights over to Eloise.
Eloise Duncan, CEO and founder of Financial Resilience Institute. Thrilled to be here today. So I'm just going to start my presentation with a short-lived experience. So John is a really good friend of mine with a different name. He's in his 60s, a handyman who lives in Langley, about an hour outside Vancouver. He's single and a low-income earner. A loner, he's a really kind man who rarely talks about his life or his financial situation. He's also ill with a disease. So in his own words, John would love to be able to just focus on his health, but he can't because of money worries. In the past month, he's had to move house from the basement suite he was living in because noise was seriously impacting his mental health for many years there. So after looking at over 50 apartments, he has just managed to move into an apartment which is the same size as the old one, but now double the rent. So he's now paying $1,475 a month plus heat every month. He's losing sleep over money, doesn't know how he's going to pay the rent, but as he told me, he had no choice. He's been working less and less because of his illness and is now drawing on his small savings, which he's told me they're not going to last forever. On a list for senior social housing, he's been told that's going to take many years. He's definitely not able to get or afford the food he needs, and the gas prices are a real problem for him. He's really doing his best to manage through financially, but is certainly more financially vulnerable than he was a year ago, as well as significantly more financially stressed. So just a little bit about the Financial Resilience Institute. We're a partner of Prosper Canada and a not-for-profit organization that's striving to help improve the financial resilience and well-being of all Canadians by reducing financial vulnerability, in particular for those who need help most or are most underserved, being a positive catalyst for change through knowledge mobilization, specifically in the financial health and resilience aspect, and through fostering financial health, inclusion, and empowerment. So this report was very kindly commissioned by Financial Resilience by Prosper Canada and is the second study building on our detailed study last year. So how do we define households with low incomes? They are households with a household income under 25,000 plus households with more than individual that have a household income between 25,000 and 50,000. Our study is drawn from a very robust sample from the June 2022 Financial Wellbeing Study, which is a longitudinal study which we've been conducting across Canada since 2017. So the sample size is just over 5,000 adult Canadians who are joint or primary financial decision makers, with a boost sample of just over 1,500 low-income Canadians. We had a similar boost in the study last year, as well as in 2018, which has given us really great longitudinal data to work with. So our survey respondents were sort of half and half male, female, a good mix of boomers, Gen X and millennials, 63% were renters, and then we had a relatively good cross-section of people that were also facing barriers, such as because they were not working owing to disabilities, etc. So just in terms of our tracking, we have the CMOR Financial Resilience Index, which I'll speak to in a very high-level way, and that is an instrument which combines with the longitudinal financial wellbeing study. So we were able to ask specific questions related to low incomes for that, low-income Canadians for that. So here's the index indicators. Essentially, people, there are 9 behavioral resilience and sentiment indicators which measure a person's financial resilience, defined as their ability to get through financial hardship, stresses, and shocks as a result of unplanned life events. And so households are scored from 0 to 100 based on their financial resilience score, where extremely vulnerable households have a score of 0 to 30, and financially resilient households have a score of 70.01 to 100. So just a little bit of context on what we're seeing at the national level. We have seen a dip in the mean Canada Financial Resilience Score of 5 points, from 55.67 to 50.52 as of June 2022. So what we've seen now is that essentially we have just about 78% of the population mainstream are now not financially resilient, representing just over 20 million households. And so that 73% is for the three segments that we define as extremely vulnerable, financially vulnerable, and approaching resilience. Very importantly, people are represented across all household income demographics across all four segments. So you can earn 100,000 and be extremely vulnerable. Similarly, you can earn a lot less than that and actually be financially resilient. What we have seen and we continue to see is that extremely vulnerable and financially vulnerable in particular are working extremely hard to manage through, for example, by significantly reducing their essential expenses. And based on a lot of data that we have, we see that there are significant nuances between household populations and across the four financial resilience segments for Canadians. Unfortunately, at the national level, 40% of households have a zero or negative savings rate at the moment, which is quite surprising, and that is 66% for low-income households. We also see a growing sort of financial hardship gap, which we saw during the pandemic through the index when we were tracking things 3 times a year. Unfortunately, in the post-pandemic inflationary environment, we're continuing to see that gap. So what you can see from this data is that, for example, as of June 2022, 88% of Canadians who are extremely vulnerable report that their household is experiencing significant financial hardship compared to 80% last year. And those numbers are very, very different compared to financially resilient households. I'm sharing this because many low-income Canadians are represented within those more vulnerable populations. We have been tracking the extent to which money worries, financial stress has been impacting different well-being dimensions of Canadians right since 2017. And the numbers are stark, and unfortunately, financial stress is now impacting the physical health of 50% of Canadians, so 1 in 2, and the mental health of 70% of Canadians. And what we see is when we score this against the index, unfortunately, people from more extremely vulnerable and financially vulnerable households score lower across all well-being elements, from financial well-being all the way through to feeling connected to their community. Through the Institute, we're also conducting longitudinal analysis. So what that means is we're tracking the same sort of 1,500 people within the overall sample of 5,000 people that answered the index studies, for example, last year compared to this year. And this work is important because what it does is it highlights mobility within the index, i.e., people can move up a segment by changing their behaviors and through other aspects. Similarly, they can slip back a segment, just like John, who I described in my lived experience story. And there are different factors why people can slip back a segment. We're doing analysis on that from a behavioral perspective right now through the Institute, and we'll be sharing insights with you over the coming weeks. So just a few summary highlights for low-income Canadians. So what we see is just over a quarter of the population are actually low income now, representing 6.4 million households. So it's quite a significant portion of the population, a slight decrease from last year, but still a significant portion. And unfortunately, the index is highlighting that there has been a serious uptick in the proportion of extremely vulnerable Canadians from just under 34% of Canadians to 41% being extremely vulnerable within lower income families as of June 2022. So we now see that 73% of low-income Canadians, which is about just under 4.7 million people, are now extremely vulnerable or financially vulnerable, which is significantly more than what we're seeing at the national level. We're also seeing the data for the two subsegments, so households with under 25,000 versus those with more than one person that have 25 to 49,000 of household income. And as you can see, the numbers are going the wrong way there as well for the past year. So one of the things we do through the Institute is measure the mean financial resilience score, not only for Canadians nationally, but for different segments, including many different ones, which we'll be releasing over the coming weeks. For low-income Canadians, what we see is that the mean financial resilience score of these people has decreased to 37.20, which is again quite a significant decrease from last year, and really back to the pre-pandemic baseline levels of 37.07 in February 2020. So some of the support that was provided by government that helped to bolster the financial resilience of low-income Canadians, with them also working hard from a behavioural perspective to bridge through during the pandemic. Now that support has been stopped for many households, obviously, we're seeing increased financial vulnerability. We look at many different stressors and debt stressors and other impacts for Canadians and lower income Canadians. This is just a little bit of a sample, but what we see is that really a huge portion of people, so 68% of households, are facing barriers impacting their ability to earn money, and just under 65% are facing significant financial hardship. A quarter of low-income households were also spending more than their income in June 2022. We saw an increase in this at the national level as well, but the numbers are again sort of quite stark for us, and we do see that this is obviously being impacted by the cost of living crisis and the increase in the cost of food and essentials, which is really putting a toll on many families. So now, unfortunately, 46% of households have a liquid savings buffer of 3 weeks or less, which again is really not good. This compares to 28% for Canadians at the national level. So quite a significant increase over the past year for lower income Canadians. And nearly 1 in 3 households now are not able to get or afford the food they need, which is something that is very concerning. Obviously, food insecurity is being measured through other studies, but these numbers are very stark. When we look at impacts of financial stress on the well-being of lower income Canadians, again, we see that nearly 80% of them, people like John in the Live story, confirm that financial stress is impacting their mental health. It's impacting the physical health of nearly 65% of lower income families. It's impacting the productivity or performance at work of these people, which is a real problem for employers, and very much causing isolation as well. So we track many different access to financial help indicators through the Institute. And what we see here is that 12.5% of lower income Canadians have experienced difficulties in accessing financial help programs over the past 12 months. So again, quite higher numbers than what we see for Canadians at the national level. 9.4% of lower income Canadians were not able to access tax filing help or support to receive government benefits they're entitled to, indicating again the huge value of the wonderful tax filing help and other resources being provided by organizations like Prosper Canada. And another just under 9% of people could not access help with managing their debt. So one of the things we're able to do through the index is sort of look at the impact of access and other aspects or interventions on the financial resilience score and financial resilience of Canadians and different populations. And this data is exploratory only because we have not done analysis on the socio-demographic differences between low-income Canadians who did and didn't access these supports. That said, this analysis does indicate the value of the financial services support being provided by nonprofits, financial services sectors in the ecosystem, because what we see is that lower income Canadians who were able to access financial help or programs or services have a significantly higher mean financial resilience score compared to those who were not able to access financial help. So financial resilience score of 39.06 compared to 24.12 based on this indicator for June 2022. Similarly, we see similar data for households that were able to access help with managing their debt and or with filing their taxes. So again, improvements there, which is really good to see. Through the Institute, we're also tracking, obviously, financial vulnerability by province as well. So we just wanted to give you a little bit of a snapshot here. That, you know, in Ontario, as an example, more Ontarian low-income Canadians are experiencing financial hardship and housing affordability issues compared to low-income Canadians overall. So we see that, you know, 67% of them are facing significant hardship compared to 65% of low-income Canadians. So this really emphasizes the criticality of nonprofits and other organizations supporting these families within their provinces, knowing that there may be differences by province. And again, we can see the slight difference data here for Ontarian low-income Canadians. So 13.6% of Ontarian lower-income families were not able to access financial help programs or services, for example. So thank you so much for the opportunity of sharing these highlights. There's more data in the report itself. I just wanted to make sure we have time for the important dialogue and Q&A. If anyone would like a copy of this report, they're very welcome to email me after this session. And again, a huge thank you to Prosper Canada and also to cooperators for enabling this work to happen.
Thank you so much, Eloise. I will now ask Eloise and Louise to put their cameras on. And while they're doing that, just a reminder that you can put any questions you have while we're speaking into the... So, hi, Louise. And while we're waiting for Eloise to put her camera on, somebody who works for a community organization serving people living on lower incomes, can you react to what you've just heard from Eloise, and how have you seen these kind of trends play out in your community?
Yeah, no, that presentation certainly resonated and also validated a lot of what we're seeing in the community. Our programs have always been oversubscribed, so that's tax filing, financial literacy, asset building programs, access to ID, access to basic banking. But had a meeting with our managers several weeks ago and shared that particularly in terms of tax filing and benefits navigation and access to identification, that we have never seen such a big gap between our capacity to provide services and the demand. So we open up our appointment slots every Monday at 9 o'clock. This week at 9:30, got an email from the team saying all the spots were full. And the previous week, that email came out at 9:31. The week before that, the email came out at 9:40. So that means that from 9:30 on, starting on Monday all the way to Friday, we spent the rest of the time telling people that we couldn't serve them, turning them away and asking them to phone again at 9 o'clock the following Monday.
Wow, that's really concerning. Can you maybe talk a little bit more, and then Eloise, I'll ask you the same question afterwards, about how you've seen COVID and the ensuing inflationary period affect people living on low and moderate incomes?
Yeah, I could talk about this for hours, but I'll keep it brief. In one word, it's been devastating. There was a brief reprieve, which I think was demonstrated in the data that the CERB payments and the supports that came into play really helped, but now they're gone. And on top of that, people are also dealing with the impact of overpayments and what that's done to their other benefits and entitlements. And so helping people navigate all of that has been really important and difficult work, but we've seen people thrown into homelessness because of that. Families are barely making ends meet. They're being pushed to the brink, and we now have a crisis in homelessness in Winnipeg, and I'm sure it's being reflected in other cities as well.
Thanks, Louise. Eloise, can you maybe talk a little bit more about what you've seen in the data about the impact of the pandemic and the period of high inflation?
Yeah, thanks so much, Sasha. So, I mean, I think I shared some of the highlights. We're tracking things across many different indicators, but as you see, the data tells a very clear story that there is an increase in lower income Canadians that are experiencing significant financial hardship. We're seeing serious impacts on their well-being. We're seeing an increase in proportion of people that cannot get or afford the food they need. Challenges from a behavioral perspective in terms of more of these populations having to resort to more predatory financial services such as installment loans and payday loans, etc. And just increases in job insecurity and also financial security, housing security, etc. So all the numbers, unfortunately, are going the wrong way, and there's no question that people are doing their very best to bridge through, but they're having to make very, very difficult trade-off decisions, and more of these people are facing barriers than they were before.
Yeah, it's really concerning, and I'm wondering, I'll ask you both this question, but maybe Eloise, we'll start with you from a kind of data perspective. Who's being disproportionately affected by these trends in increasing financial vulnerability?
So, I mean, I think that's a very big and a multi-layered question. It's a great question. And I think one of the things that we're doing at the Institute is also looking at different populations and how those overlay. So, for example, we know that more Canadians, for example, that are lower income are also represented as being, for example, single parent families or not being able to work owing to a disability. They're more likely to have income or expense volatility. But we're really seeing that the most financially vulnerable populations are being the most impacted by the inflationary environment. So we'll be releasing some more data on this over the next couple of weeks. But Canadians with a disability have one of the lowest mean financial resilience scores of all populations. They have a score of 29.79 as of June. So that's compared to the 39.6 for low-income Canadians. So if you're low income and you also have a disability, you're much more likely to have a much lower mean financial resilience score and to have been more impacted by the pandemic. Similarly, people that have poor or fair credit scores and are challenged from a debt perspective and or impacted by rising interest rates are really, really financially vulnerable right now. And then we see, again, this sort of crosses all segments, but people like my friend John, who have been impacted by by life events, such as reduced work or having to move home because of a non-controllable issue. Again, those Canadians across the spectrum, but particularly low-income Canadians, are very, very challenged.
Thanks, Eloise. Louise, I'll ask you the same question. Who are you seeing most disproportionately affected?
Yeah, well, coincidentally, just had a Manitoba Financial Empowerment Network meeting just prior to this, and one of the questions that we posed to the group was, who are you most concerned about in our community from a financial wellness perspective? And it definitely, I'll echo what Eloise said. it definitely is consistent with the groups that are at disproportionate risk of living in poverty. So people with disabilities, recent immigrants, older single adults, Indigenous peoples. One group that was highlighted, which surprised me a bit, and I agree with this, is low wage earners, increasing concern about that particular group. And I also really appreciate Eloise's highlighting intersectionality and how that puts people at double, triple jeopardy if you have a disability and you're Indigenous. And so we also see that because it just layers on barrier upon barrier upon barrier and makes it really, really challenging for folks. In terms of the homelessness crisis, it's disproportionately impacting the Indigenous community. Just completed a street census for this year. A group of agencies in Winnipeg did that, revealed that 70% of the people that were surveyed were Indigenous. 9 in 10, nearly 9 in 10, 89% of the people who slept outdoors in abandoned buildings, tents, vehicles, encampments, or other public locations were Indigenous. And we have people that are literally living in the backyard of SEED, in the abandoned building next door, in cars. So it's all around us in terms of the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Louise. The one other thing, so completely agree with everything you say, just based on the data that we see. The other thing I missed saying when we were talking about the intersectionality is women, you know, women and single parents. And we've been tracking the financial resilience gender gap for many, many years through the Institute, something we're really, really passionate about. And, you know, if you are a woman who is a single parent who also has is not able to work owing to a disability or is caring for others, you know, you're going to be more challenged.
Yeah, thanks, Eloise and Louise. Eloise, you've kind of, you know, painted a very dire picture, but if we look at the 2020 poverty data from the federal government, which is the latest year that we have, it paints a much rosier picture. Can you kind of try to square that circle for us?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, you know, why I created the index is because we need to have different measures beyond asset, traditional, you know, GDP and asset and income measures for Canadians to really see what's going on. And so, I mean, that's why we created the Seymour Financial Resilience Index, to really measure financial vulnerability and financial resilience in different ways, and then link that to impacts on well-being, for example. So, I mean, I am a firm believer that it's very critical for policymakers, financial institutions, and others to use this data and track what's going on for more vulnerable populations from a longitudinal perspective, to really shine a light on the communities and the populations that need more targeted support as a result of what's going on underneath the surface, and that underneath the surface, or underneath their assets or their credit score, is essentially their financial vulnerability and their financial stress and their well-being.
Thanks, Eloise. Louise, I'll let you add on to that if you have anything to add, but I also wanted to ask you, you know, we're hearing from community organizations like SEED, and you spoke to this a bit at the beginning, that there's kind of an outside need for financial help services, and that people are coming with more and more complex problems that take a lot more time to deal with. I'm wondering, you know, how is SEED dealing with this challenge, and what's needed to better support this work in communities?
Yeah, so I'd say cross-sectoral partnerships and partnerships with other community organizations has been really important and helpful, because along with that comes an infusion of all sorts of in-kind support, which is helpful. But we've also had to make really tough decisions about the best use of resources. So are reallocating resources internally to areas of highest demand, so taking money out of, say, our match savings program area and putting it towards tax filing, because that's where the gap between our our service delivery capacity and the demand is the greatest and where we see the greatest level of desperation. We have also, we are dealing with more complex cases, but we're also making really difficult decisions about scaling back the depth of service delivery so that we can serve more people. So we're turning fewer people away, and that's really, really challenging for staff, many of whom have that experience of living on a low income. We're also trying to find funding to expand provision of services to meet the demand, but all of the new funding sources are time limited and project based, so that's very unstable. And so I'd say as a consequence, I think it'd be really interesting to apply a similar lens to organizations. And I'd say that the sector, and this also came out at our Manitoba Financial Empowerment Network meeting that we just had, the community-based organizations are now, I think, less resilient than they have been. There was an infusion of funding related to CERB from foundations, from various levels of government. That's gone, but the need is still there and arguably even greater. And so we're trying to do more with less. Staff are also being impacted by COVID, and so there's always a disproportionately high proportion of staff that are off work, and so that's leading to stress, burnout, and staff are also dealing with inflationary pressures. Our sector is chronically underpaid when compared to sort of comparable work that's being done within government or other institutions. And so one of our community partners said, how can we be asking our staff to support others when they're also struggling personally? And so that's really, really challenging. So there's an urgent need for more resources to provide more financial stability to those organizations and also to improve the quality of those jobs.
Thanks, Louise, and appreciate, hearing, not only the impact on the people who are coming to you to benefit from your services, but also on the staff. Eloise, you talked a little bit about this, but can you talk a little bit more about what the data highlight around the efficacy and availability of financial help services for people on low income?
Yes, I mean, I think at the highest level, the numbers don't look too bad, but when you look at under the hood at what's going on for lower income Canadians and those who are extremely vulnerable with a financial resilience score of 0 to 30, for example, the access challenges across many different types of financial help sort of aspects, help with tax filing help to access to help in terms of relevant products and solutions to support these people are the numbers are worse across the board. And so, I think it's really, really important to be measuring access for these populations and looking at when the numbers, as Louise has said, the demand is much higher. And there are access challenges for these populations which need to be filled by, from my perspective, not just from the not-for-profit sector, but they need to be filled by financial institutions and other organizations that have a role in supporting these people.
Thanks, Eloise. I mentioned that that this work was made possible by a generous contribution from cooperators, and they have been funding us to look at the gap in affordable, trustworthy, and appropriate financial help services for people on low incomes. And we're finding that really there is a huge gap, that these services aren't available in a lot of places, and that where they are available, as you say, Louise, they're really underfunded and there isn't the capacity. So we've been advocating for sustained government support for community financial help services and also for their integration into other government services that are accessed by people on low incomes. We're also kind of working with the federal government to help ensure that people are accessing the benefits for which they're eligible. Louise, can you comment on these and other kinds of policies that we need to see from all levels of government to kind of turn the tide on these trends and better support people who are living on low incomes?
Yeah, so huge shout out to Prosper. I can't tell you how much we appreciate the work that you're doing on the funding front. And SEED and our partner organizations have been a direct beneficiary of those efforts. And it is making a difference in the lives of people here in Manitoba. So I think in addition to that urgent need for sustained core funding, I would say that it would also be beneficial because a lot of our work is around benefits navigation. So to also be working towards systems change to reduce the barriers and make it easier for individuals to access benefits. So auto enrollment options are really helpful, plain language, like all of those pieces, and really engaging with community around what the barriers are and what that needs to look like. The other thing that I would also say is the pandemic accelerated a process that was already underway in a lot of government agencies, which was to shift to more virtual phone, like online service delivery, and to either completely eliminate or severely restrict in-person access, which disproportionately negatively impacts the most financially vulnerable. Like, we're all aware of the digital divide and what those implications are. And so I think it's really critical for CRA, Service Canada, social assistance offices to reintroduce or expand in-person access, because essentially part of what's happening is work that previously used to be done by government is essentially being offloaded onto community organizations. And so I can't stress that point enough. I feel like I'm shouting at the wind most of the time, but I think it is really, really critical if we really want to make sure that these programs, these income supports are available to the people in Canada that most need them.
Thanks, Louise. So that is the end of my prepared questions. So we've got some questions from the audience, and please continue to send them in. The first question is for Eloise. Has the Seymour Resilience Financial Index been peer reviewed? That is, how has it been vetted to determine its descriptive usefulness? And do you have any links for articles?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. So yes and yes. So the Seymour Financial Resilience Index builds on over 6 years of longitudinal financial wellbeing studies data for Canada. So it's a it builds on a tremendous amount of data for Canada. The index has been peer reviewed by Statistics Canada. And last year, we launched a joint report with Statistics Canada on the financial resilience and financial well-being of Canadians during the COVID-19 pandemic, comparing the index data to actual transactional administrative data held by Statistics Canada. So it's been peer reviewed by Statistics Canada. It's also been peer reviewed by the C.D. Howe Institute, Canada's leading think tank, and we have published intelligence memos via them through the index as well. It's also been peer reviewed by leading organizations such as Vancity, who's our core funder for the Institute, that's using the index, and other organizations. And then lastly, it's been peer reviewed more informally on a global basis through the UN PRB, which is a group of 28 banks and credit unions around the world, facilitated by the UN, that are all committed to financial health and inclusion, impact measurement and innovation across the world. So the Institute's indicators and index have been thrown into the mix of many indicators, and been peer reviewed and sort of risen to the top as core indicators on a global basis as well. Oh,
Great,
so
thanks, Eloise.
your question on reports, if you go to our website, which is www.finresilience.institute.org, and then you go to the reports section, there's a ton of reports in there from 2017 to date. And so I just shared just a couple of the highlights from the June 2022 report, but that one and others are available there for free for everyone.
Thanks, Eloise. And as I mentioned before, we will be sending out the link to the report to all webinar registrants after the webinar. The next two questions are kind of similar, so I'll ask them both and would love to hear from both of you. What are the reasons why participants couldn't access help? And the similar one is, what was the barrier to entry for consumers not receiving help for debt or financial help? So maybe, we'll start with Eloise and then Louise, you can add on.
Yeah, sorry, can you just reframe the question? I just want to make sure I can answer it based on the data that we have.
I think essentially it's like, why are people not able to access financial help services?
Yeah,
Is
so
that something that you looked at? I mean, maybe it's just you asked, could they?
yeah,
Did you ask why?
It's a great question. I think we would need to do, from a data analytics perspective, we can go deeper on that. But I think it's a lot of the different reasons that we've already discussed in terms of these households facing more barriers from a number of different perspectives. But Louise, maybe you want to answer that, maybe based on what you're seeing at the front line.
So I would say one of the biggest barriers is just the availability of neutral, trusted sources of financial help that essentially have the best interest of the participant in mind. So that would be one barrier. But then when you, again, take that sort of intersectional lens and think about particular populations and the barriers that they face, obviously, in-person services are still something that is really challenging, and for a really high proportion of the population that SEED serves and our partner organizations, they don't have regular access to phones, internet, email, and so they need to be able to access the services in person. And since the pandemic hit, there's been fewer of those kinds of services available, even through community organizations. And then when you look at specific populations, like recent immigrants to Canada, then you have language barriers, which is where our partnerships come in, and being able to deliver and provide services in first languages. Similar issues with the kinds of accommodations that are required for people with disability. And so again, we work with disability serving organizations, but often you have one staff person within that organization that's responsible, and it's like either something that they're doing off the side of their desk, or they're funded at sort of 10 hours a week to do that. And again, the demand far outstrips their capacity to be able to deliver those services. So there's just some of the reasons why it is challenging.
Thanks, Louise. The next question, I can take a first stab at answering, and then I will pass it on to both of you. The question is there work or studies happening to look at systemic barriers to claiming government benefits? So I can direct you to the Prosper Canada website for a lot of the kind of work that we've done looking at specific populations who are kind of, not getting their benefits or who have larger barriers. Recently we've looked at people with disabilities, but we've also kind of done work looking at the barriers to other populations like newcomers. And also recently the Auditor General released a report basically saying the federal government needs to work harder to reach hard to reach populations in terms of access to benefits. And so that's something that we're hearing a lot. We're hearing a lot in conversations with government. This is becoming a real focus. And they are working to try to figure this out, but I think also are cognizant of the need to kind of garner the kind of expertise of community organizations. So Eloise, I don't know if you have anything to add, any kind of work that you have seen or that you've been involved with.
Yeah, I'll just echo what you've said, that there is a high degree of receptivity within government systems, and so they're actively engaged. So we have representatives from all three levels of government that are part of the Manitoba Financial Empowerment Network. And so that takes many forms in terms of addressing those systemic barriers. So we had a suggestion from the Canada Revenue Agency to do something that had been done in other jurisdictions, which was to organize a service delivery expo, one location, one day. People that are experiencing homelessness can access a whole range of services. So everything from medical care to getting their taxes filed, to accessing housing, to getting ID. And so we brought together over 30 different service providers. And I think the last expo we served over 1,000 people. So that's one example of a type of intervention, but then there's interventions within those systems. And so you might think it's odd that I mentioned ID as a financial help service, but part of what we've recognized is basic identification is a prerequisite to being able to then create that financial stability. And so we have to start there. And so we're currently in the process of working with Vital Statistics and Employment and Income Assistance and then Homelessness Winnipeg to establish an access to ID network. And Vital Stats, for example, is really, really interested in hearing from community organizations that are helping people navigate those systems. What can we do better? How can we provide better services? We're going to be exploring an ID storage solution, for example, specifically to meet and address the needs of people that are experiencing homelessness. We're also going to be trying to work with the justice system so that people, before they exit the justice system, have the ID that they need and they're not part of that long queue on Monday and having to come in week after week after week to try and get something as basic as ID so that they can have a fresh start. So those are just a few examples. I could go on, but that work is active, it's happening. Community organizations are engaged, they're willing to take the time to be part of things like our Financial Empowerment Policy Committee and engage with government. And we're also getting receptivity on the side of government as well.
Wow, that's
Thanks,
fantastic.
Louise.
Fantastic. I don't have anything to add, but I mean, that's wonderful.
Well, Eloise, I do have a question for you, which is somebody's asking about the different demographics that you looked at when collecting data. So you mentioned, you know, for example, looking at the gender gap, but what were the different demographics that you looked at?
Yeah, great question. So within the national, within the national study, we capture a lot of demographic data. So obviously the obvious ones are, you know, age, household income, province, ethnicity, whether people are renters versus homeowners with or without a mortgage. Yeah, and then we look at many other different attributes as well. So whether people are you know, reporting using specific products or services that may be more predatory, etc. So there's a lot of rich demographic and then financial behavioral data that's captured by the Institute. Yeah, so I don't know if anyone's got any questions more about the low-income Canadians, but we're able to slice and dice the data many different ways based on the financial well-being study, which is it's like a 15 to 18-minute online study, so a huge number of questions are in there, which are smashed against the index. The other thing that's probably important to note just for going forward is we are always able to add new or customized questions to the financial well-being study and then smash it against the index for organizations that work with us. So there is the ability to go much deeper around a specific population or an access challenge, but sort of build in the benchmark data against the index and the longitudinal, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Eloise. The next question I think is for you, but I'm also interested in your perspective, Louise. So they're kind of referencing the slide showing how people benefit from access to tax filing and benefits navigation help, and wondering if there are other markers in this research for what's helping to move Canadians into the financial resilient categories.
So I think, you know, the work that we've done so far, the analytics we've done so far is exploratory. There's absolutely the ability to do deeper dive analytics and correlation analysis, etc., through the data that we've got on low-income Canadians. But I think there is also an opportunity and a need to combine the quant data that we've got with qualitative insights as well, that gets to some of the intersected aspects of this for Canadians. I don't know if you agree with that, Louise.
Yeah, yeah, I would respond in a couple of ways. So one is when it comes to tax filing, there's just the potential infusion of significant amounts of money into the household from the tax refund, from the Canada Child Benefit. And so a lot of benefits are connected to filing taxes. And so I think that helps in terms of financial stability in a really practical and direct way. So we've literally had people who hadn't filed taxes for years and years and years, who were homeless, getting their taxes filed and being eligible for potentially thousands of dollars. And so that's transformative. Like, that means that someone can actually afford first and last month's rent, security deposit, whatever they need to be able to transition to housing. And then in terms of some of the other financial help services, such as financial literacy and financial coaching. So we've also done sort of pre-post around our financial literacy, and it's partly about the information, but I would say that it's also about things like, because a lot of times people already know what they need to do. It's almost like going on a diet, like, you know what food is good for you. And so it's a question of being in a supported environment where you can actually do what you already know. And also align what it is that you want to do with your longer term goals. And so we've measured things like statistically significant change in people's sense of hope, their sense of confidence, also their willingness to get financial help from other sources. And so all of that, and reduce stress levels. And so I think all of that, I think, would result in better financial resilience scores. And then qualitatively, and those are the, like, when I've sat in on focus groups, yeah, it's just really interesting the kind of impact that engagement in those programs has on individuals, and the ripple effects. And so part of what really strikes me is to have people's knowledge and confidence grow to the extent where they start sharing the information with other people in their low-income households or their kids, or even their community center. So we've had people take our money management training book to their women's group and start, like, introducing it to their group and running through the different activities and exercises. And so for me, those kinds of accounts are really inspiring, because I think what happens to people shift from being in this sort of survival day-to-day mode and just wondering, how am I going to get out of this, to actually having the cognitive space and the emotional support to be able to have a line on sight on what they need to do, and to be able to start taking those steps. So that sense of personal advocacy, I think, is huge.
Yeah, Louise, I completely agree with that. And I would echo that. From our data, we are capturing many other indicators around, as you say, like confidence in my ability to make informed decisions, confidence in my ability to achieve my short-term savings goals, which is one of the index indicators. And then also indicators around, as you say, empowerment and just overall well-being. And you're absolutely right. There are so many sort of positive knock-on effects for people that don't just learn about these products and services or build their financial literacy, but get help with changing and adjusting their money habits as appropriate, and accessing the right supports and services to help them move forward in tangible ways.
Thank you both. We're at time. I just didn't want to cut you off because I loved what you were saying. So I really want to thank you all for joining us, and thank Louise and Eloise for your insights. Very appreciate your joining us. As we mentioned, the resources shared today will be emailed to you. So we'll be sending an email soon, and the recorded webinar will be posted on our Learning Hub. which you can access at this link. There's also the reports that I was talking about around barriers to access to benefits. And if you want to contact any of us, here is our contact info. Again, thank you so much, Eloise and Louise, for joining us. We really appreciate, benefiting from your expertise today. So thanks, everyone.
Very much.